Most ancient civilizations from around the world assumed that the world was flat. And the reason why they did this was because in prehistory, it does appear to be flat. But I want to talk about why some people believe the ancient Egyptians at one point had figured out that the world was a sphere. And these claims are not nonsense. There is no real evidence that the ancient Egyptians sat down and said, "We know for a fact," or even suggested that the world was a sphere. But there is evidence pointing to the idea that they knew. Now, I made a video before that was talking about this, and the reason why I talked about it is because the mathematics they use, the people, to try and suggest that the people in ancient Egypt knew the earth was round is different than the information they would have used specifically themselves. But first, let's start with the flat earth theory. It is not a myth or a suggestion that the ancient Egyptians at one point absolutely believed the earth was flat. This is a fact, and it's backed up by many things, one being the fact of observation, but also depictions and writings by themselves that show that they 100% believed that the earth was flat at one point. At the bottom, we have someone called Geb. Geb is the earth, and in him or underneath him is the underworld. If we look at this sphere shape, the stars, that's Nut. Nut is in a dome shape, not because it's just a depiction of stars or anything like that. No. Nut is this shape because she represents the actual dome of the earth. And you can see her hands and feet are located on the horizons, as is written in ancient Egyptian texts. Nut stretches through the horizons. We also know that Ra is thought to be in a boat and he sails through Nut and then ends up in Geb, the underworld, and then re-rises again on the other side. Now, this does not suggest that the ancient Egyptians did not later on, and I don't mean 10,000 years later, I mean around 2000 BC, it does not suggest that these people did not develop some of the maths later. In fact, there is mathematics that is already enough to have proved the world was round. One of these is the Rhind Papyrus. Another is the Moscow Papyrus. But if we first look at the Rhind Papyrus, there are many suggestions that the ancient Egyptians used geometry not only to compare different shapes to each other, like squares and circles, where they try to square circles, and also comparing summits. So, in other words, comparing pyramids to other pyramids in different locations. If there's one thing that the ancient Egyptians had, it's time. If there's another thing they had, it's space. Now, this does go to a couple suggestions. Let's take two suggestions. Firstly, is it possible for the ancient Egyptians to have practically used the Rhind Papyrus in order to figure out that the earth was round? Not only is it possible, but for a lot of people, it seems probable.
And I present to you the equation here of the area of a circle. For ancient Egyptians, the area of a circle is d minus 1/9 of d, all squared. So take the left circle. It has a diameter of d. The approximation of the area of that circle is the area of the black square on the right. So basically we take a square.
Now, there are a few suggestions that these ancient Egyptian mathematics that could have possibly been used to determine the Earth curve were stolen from ancient Egypt by the ancient Greeks. Now, we don't even need to speculate about this because we know it's true. Let's take Pythagoras, for example. Two Greeks suggested that Pythagoras got his ideas from ancient Egypt and that he was educated in Egypt. If we take Aristophanes, we know that he was one of those who suggested a way of figuring out that the world was curved. And one of his methods was using Aswan and comparing the shadows from two places. These comparisons make sense, but they also don't at the same time because his math is a little off unless you switch the information. This suggests that the information that he got came from ancient Egypt. Aristophanes himself says that he was educated in Egypt and looked through ancient texts. But there are several problems with this theory. Firstly, it means that the Egyptians, or what the Egyptians knew, would also be limited information. Because if we look at people like Pythagoras and his followers, they only get so far with the information that the earth is a sphere of some kind. One of them even suggested that the earth revolves around a great fire in space. Some suggested that it's something hanging in space, suspended on nothing. This is around 500 BC. But let's for a moment return to the Rhind Papyrus and start to name dates and names. We know that the Rhind Papyrus was especially used for things like the pyramids, things like houses. It was used for practical uses. And so, if it was used to calculate the Earth, we should find inside of this detail information that says, yeah, if you want to calculate the world, do this. There is also other suggestions to show that even in later dates, the most elite of men still did not believe the idea that the earth was round. So, for the example, this one is from 1500 BC. They're about that date. That's where about the Rhind Papyrus is. That's very late in the history of Egypt, 1500 BC. But even in 1400 BC, with Thutmose III, we find him saying things like this. Also, remember, a lot of these are meant to be literal because the ancient Egyptians were very religious. So he says, he is Horus with a powerful arm, a excellent fortress to his army, a refuge to the subjects, who attacks every land with infighting, who rescues Egypt on the battlefield, a protector who does not fear the rapacious. He is a bull. Now, here's the important part, whose southern borders reach to the crest of the world, meaning that there is a limit to the earth, which, by the way, would be surrounded by water in ancient Egyptian mythology, to the ends of this world. So, in other words, again, he is suggesting that the earth has ends rather than it being a sphere that never ends. But not only this, the next line is a dead giveaway because he then goes straight into it and he uses the word nut too. The word nut being heaven. So everybody focus on the very last sentence. This will prove that even by this date, they had not shifted from the idea that the heaven is placed on the earth. And the only reason they can't see it is because they haven't reached the limits of the world. So, for example, MHTJ, RPHWW, and WSTT. So you can see there that that is the Romanized version of Egyptian. And the very last word, NWT, is Nut, meaning heaven, or the goddess Nut. This is extremely important in the ancient Egyptian mythology because you can see again, Nut rests on the earth. And on the earth, there is the underworld underneath, and blah, blah, blah. There's Shu in the middle, who is the air. And if you disqualify this information and say it doesn't matter, then you're just disqualifying the mythology of ancient Egypt, which doesn't make sense. But let us go back to this last sentence. What does it say? So it says, and the northern to the ends of Asia, to the support of heaven. We'll start again. Whose southern borders reach the crest of the world, to the ends of this world, and the northern to the ends of Asia, to the supports of heaven. So, in other words, what they're saying is that heaven is supported on Asia side. So, this is to the east. To the south side, this is to the south, and the ends of the earth. So, in a dome shaped way, the earth sits on, or the heavens sit on the earth in its limits, in its crest. And yes, the word WPT does mean crest, or extremity, or final destination, or whatever you want to pick. Now, again, this information of flat earth amongst the ancients is not special. In fact, it's pretty typical and is depicted in several ways. This obviously not being the original way of being depicted, but a translation of images. So let's first look at the one in depicting it in a clearer way. So we can see here, upper world. This is the sky, which I think its name is Pu. And as you can see, Pu rests on the east and western side of the earth, meaning Pu, the solar god, is rested on top of the earth, the same dome shape that you would find in ancient Egypt or just about any other ancient civilization. Now, how do we know that this is earth? Well, we know that according to ancient Mayan mythology, the earth rests on the back of a turtle. And you can see there that there is a turtle. What is being depicted here is the origin of maize and how it shoots out from the earth. Depicted on either side is the god of animals, and you can see here that they are pouring water, indicating the rain, onto this god from the east and the west. In ancient Mayan mythology, the underworld was named Xibalba. And just under this world, you can see Xibalba. Here's an image of Tikal in the jaws of Xibalba. Usually, this image is used by ancient aliens to try and say that this is Xibalba or Tikal operating a spaceship trying to go to space. But what really is the jaws of Xibalba, or the underworld, and Tikal is basically in the jaws of the underworld. If you can see, you see here the turtle with its face shooting out of it. If you look carefully at the picture, you can see it. You can see Xibalba located right below the turtle, and you can see the sky god. Now, you might say, okay, that's fine for the Mayans, but the Mayans are not Egyptians. And so it's possible that the Mayans didn't figure it out, but the Egyptians figured it out. And I say to that, it is possible. It's very possible. I actually think that towards the end of the Egyptian run, the Egyptians not only figured it out, but passed the information to the Greeks. Now, how vague or how direct that information was is something we will never know. In fact, let's talk about someone who thought he knew. In fact, not only did he think he knew, he thought that the ancient Egyptians knew about gravity and that they knew that the world was in space just floating and they knew what the stars were and all of this. He is the greatest mathematical genius in the world. And he thought that the ancient Egyptians had secret mathematical concepts that, when discovered, would prove his theory of gravity correct. His name was Isaac Newton. If we read, the pioneering scientist also tied his interest to the pyramid to his efforts to understand gravity. He thought that the ancient Greeks had successfully measured Earth's circumference using a unit called stadia, which he believed was borrowed from the Egyptians by translating ancient measurements. Newton hoped to validate his own theory of gravity. Though his discoveries have influenced the course of scientific advancement for centuries, Sotheby's notes that to Newton himself they were secondary to his greater studies in alchemy and theology. It was the latter that was the greatest motivation for his research on ancient metrology. Now, it is interesting where units in ancient Egypt come from and why I think we need to look into that as its own separate video. And it is true that the ancient Greeks adopted stuff like the stadia into their writing. While all of this is true, a lot of the measurements in Egypt only became standardized by around 1500 BC. Meaning, if you got a ruler, which wasn't a ruler, it was like rope, but if you got a ruler from ancient Egypt prior to a specific date, the ruler would have different ways of getting measurements, whether it's feet, whether it's head, whether it's the eyebrow, whether whatever it is they used to measure, they would start with that, and it was regional. And then there was a standardization which used the arm. And like again, I said, this is a video for another day. This tells us that the mathematics that was prior and the one that was after around 1500 BC, there's a different level of accuracy that you're dealing with. Now, in the old world, the historical world, we know that there are other people who made the suggestions. In fact, they made the mathematical calculations that the world was a sphere. But not only did they make this calculation, they made a hell of a lot more calculations and changed the world forever. For example, there's Aryabhat or Aryabhata. Aryabhata, as you can see here, calculated pi, said the earth rotates on its axis, and he, well, they say here, and he did this all in the 5th century, which is not the fascinating part. He also invented the number 0. This person also inspired the later to come Muslim scholars that would figure out the size of the earth, which was already figured out by Aryabhat, and they would figure out how to calculate the size, how to calculate all these pieces of information by looking at the works of people like this who would grow and grow in India. Now, here's where things get a little bit interesting. So we know that Al-Biruni, the mathematician, 100% knew about Indian mathematics and that he was highly inspired by it. Al-Biruni being the person who calculated the Earth's size roughly to about a couple meters. Now, the interesting part is, though this was unique inside of the Arabian world and India, it doesn't seem like it would be impossible for the Egyptians to have done this. But again, evidence beats us back because we don't find any evidence of them doing this. But they had the maths to do it. They had the writings to tell us about elevation and comparison to Earth and angles and all of this information. It's there, but we do not find the smoking gun where we can go. Now, keep in mind, there are so many other papyri that have not been fully translated. In another video, we'll see whether or not the ancient Egyptians used the number zero in a mathematical sense. And we'll also check if the ancient Egyptians used, or the ancient Greeks used, some of the terms and symbols from ancient Egypt to develop this spherical earth. Now, I will tell you the answer is probably yes. And it's so soon and apparent that we have no other way of checking except for suggesting that there's something inside of the mathematics of ancient Egypt that would lead them in that direction. Now, of course, there is Greek philosophy, but even that has been suggested. I will also answer your questions. Remember, like, share, donate. Definitely the people who donate get their own questions answered in video form faster than the other people. Thank you very much.